This is Tracy Drummond, and today is Sunday, the 16th of October, 2016. I am in Tarzana, California with Jim Gwin, former bird staffer, and I am here to talk to him today about his experiences with a bird, but also many other aspects of his life and career. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this project.
My pleasure.
And I'm excited that we were able to get this interview in while I'm out here. So I just like to say that the content, the interview is going to be put online. We're going to make it part of our Great Speckled Bird digital collection, and that we feel like once we have all the interviews together and start putting that content online, that it'll be a very rich resource for researchers who are writing about a variety of topics. So
will it be transcribed also?
We unfortunately do not have a budget for transcription. Right. It can be quite expensive.
Yeah.
We don't, but I can talk to you more about how we're going to put them online later. So the question I always start with is, where were you born and when?
I was born in Houston, Texas in 1943, Harris County, and I lived there about 3 years. Don't have a lot of memories, a few hurricanes, and a few other things, but I moved to Mississippi when I was three and a half.
What took y'all to Mississippi?
Well, my mother and father had grown up there, and my father and mother had gone there in 1930 to get jobs. My father worked for the Houston Power and Light Company as kind of a middle manager, and so they enjoyed their life there in the city, which was different from where they had grown up, for about 15 years, and then my grandmother died, and my mother wanted to be near her father, and so that we moved back.
Okay. And what kind of work did your dad do when you guys got back to Mississippi?
He managed an appliance store in a little town called Indianola, Mississippi. And he did that from about 1946 to he was 80 years old, so it was 1986.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And was your mother a stay-at-home mom?
She was a stay-at-home mom most of the time until I went to college, and then she worked for what we call the welfare department at that time.
Okay. What did she do there?
She processed welfare claims and worked with the local community and allocating resources.
Okay. So is Indianola a smaller town?
Indianola is a town of about 10,000, a little bit less than 10,000, predominantly black, maybe 67% black. It's right in the middle. It's called the crossroads of the Delta. Right in the middle of the Mississippi Delta, which was the rich cotton growing area. It's very flat land, lots of cotton at that time. And obviously there was a lot of issues there that historically came along with that, in the beginning with slavery and segregation, discrimination. So it was an interesting place to grow up.
How so?
Well, when you're little, you don't know all of these things, so you learn it in bits and parts. But as most of the South, it was a totally segregated society, and schools, churches, everything was socially segregated. People worked together, but the whole social system of white supremacy was pretty entrenched. My sister had a professor at Ole Miss called James Silver, wrote a book called The Closed Society. I don't know if you ever heard of that, and came out about 1963 or something like that, after the Meredith riot at Ole Miss, and he described it pretty well, that it was just a thought system, social system that was organized to maintain white supremacy, and the relationships that were built on cotton management of labor, and white dominance. That's the way it was. But as a child, you experience it in bits and pieces. You don't know what it's about, but you see things, and as you grow up and you experience things as you grow up, that makes it more clear to you. The separation was one thing that was pretty obvious. We lived out in the country on a small piece of land that my grandfather had bought from my mother, and it was farmed by a middle-aged black farmer and his wife, and our relationships, as far as I ever knew, were pretty good, and they were always nice to me, and I don't know what relationship my grandfather had with him. I really don't. He provided a tractor for him and things like that, because when we got there, we were still, agriculture in many cases was still in the 1800s. The land was being farmed with a mule and plowed, and everything was hand-picked. Cotton was hand-picked, and so it was an immense amount of labor, and even taking the cotton to the compress and to the gin was done with an old wagon, a wagon which you put sides on, but it's not that large. And so the mules and the horses, you had one mule, one horse, and that cotton would be taken to town. This was in the early 50s that I really became more aware of that. And so I grew up around that. I could see it. When I drove back and forth to town, I could see the many sharecropper houses that were on other people's land that mostly African Americans lived in, but there were a lot of poor whites in the Delta also, and they lived in a typically larger, if you know the John Grisham book, Unpainted House, that was typical of what houses were like. And essentially in 1950, the South was still coming out of the Depression. It was still a very poor area, and even in the 60s. Still is today. That area is probably the poorest area, one of the poorest areas in the country. So I could see that, and as I went through that as a young person, I was raised in the church, and I had certain moral feelings, and it just didn't seem right. It didn't feel right, and you had to have feeling for people who lived in conditions like many people lived in. I don't know that I saw the homes of the black middle class. There was a small black middle class that lived in the town, but most of what I saw was the homes that were on my road, and it bothered me. And so that was kind of the beginning of my learning about it, and so there are other things that, of course, in the 50s started to happen that were challenged my understanding. The biggest thing was the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. I think I was 11. I was 11 then. And that was a big commotion, throughout the South and locally, and in actual fact, the White Citizens Council was originated in Indianola from a former football player from Mississippi State. And,
the White Citizens Council?
Mm-hmm. And effectively what they did was to pressure the merchants to, and some may have eagerly done it, I don't know. As a child, you don't know all of these things. It's a little bit like, what's the Watchmen book that Harper Lee wrote. You're not quite aware of everything that's going on until you get a little older. But most of the merchants belonged to it, because even if you felt differently about it, if you wanted to do business, it was hard to not join. So it was that was part of the background. You know, I try to remember how I felt about it. I know my parents were upset about it.
They talked to you about being upset?
They didn't talk to me. They made comments about it. I don't, you know, it's hard to remember exactly, but I do have the impression they were against Brown versus Board of Education. And, you know, over the long run, I think my initial feeling was that it was right, but you know, it took me a while to get there, you know, to firm that out. I just, what could be wrong about that, you know? But there was, you know, there were a lot of attitudes that prevented black children from playing with white children, though there were many who did, particularly out in the country, and these are the things you experience as a child, and you really don't know, particularly if you don't have insight from adults in your life. So that was kind of the way I grew up, dealing with Brown versus Board. Of course, the Emmett Till was quite shocking, and you can't feel like that, you know, that revealed to me how violent the South was, because that was something new to me as a 12, 13-year-old maybe. And these events just kept happening that made me confront my own feelings through high school. Eventually until you know, by the time I was getting out of high school, and, you know, you saw I know I felt very positively about the sit-in in North Carolina, the first sit-ins in North Carolina that I knew about. I mean, these events were big. And so I was moving towards the radical position of, I will be an integrationist. And I think by the time I was a senior in high school, graduating from high school, I had moved to that and saw myself a little outside of the standard view of the South. And there were other events too that came along with that. They weren't just about civil rights or race relations or poverty. Poverty certainly was one of the things that upset me the most in that area, because I had the opportunity to see the houses, and then when I was a little bit older and working, I was working to help my father collect from the monthly payments for refrigerators or appliances, and I would visit homes, and it was just pretty shocking, the quality of the homes that were provided for sharecroppers. I mean, it was pretty shocking. So that, you know, that was pretty upsetting to me, and I just knew this wasn't the right way, and something needed to change. And taking action in that environment took me a little longer. And the other area of change and progress in my thinking had to do with foreign affairs and just building up the knowledge that eventually fed into the way I thought eventually. I mean, we watched, it was the era that children watched TV news. I mean, because that was what was on TV. So I was sitting in the morning and watched Dave Garroway and Today, and so I was there and listening when we learned that Russia had the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb. We had Life magazine too, so I had learned about the Holocaust and other things like that you know, developed my concern about what was going on in the world. It gave me a real sense of it, and eventually other events from the 60s, Vietnam started. Well, I should mention this because this, I think, as a child was a thing that impressed me, frightened me the most, and that was the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. And I can remember as a 6, 7-year-old going to bed at night and hearing airplanes going overhead and thinking, okay, is this the one with the atomic bomb? You know, because that was there, and the TV news was full of the threats back and forth between Eisenhower and Foster Douglas and Dulles, and you know, it was a very tense time, and we would see pictures of atomic bombs. And I had seen, I mean, that's what I should, I think I was going, that there were pictures of Hiroshima in Life magazine. I knew what it was about, and by the time I was in high school, then there were a couple of books there that really grabbed me. One was Failsafe, which was a book that talked about the very clear possibility that we could have a nuclear annihilation. And then an even more frightening book was a kind of a science fiction, projection called On the Beach by Neville Shute that depicted what it would be like after the nuclear war. So those were things that sunk into my understanding of world events and began to say to me, this has got to change, you know, this needs to change. And Vietnam I started following as a high school student too, and developed an interest in, and at that time I think I felt that you know, I believed that what the U.S. was doing first, it did seem that France, it was good that France, as a colonial power, we were the great democratic country, right? It was good that they were defeated. I can understand the Vietnamese wanting France out, but I think I still felt that, well, the U.S. had a mission there to bring democracy and followed JF Kennedy into the war, and thought there might be idealistically a democratic purpose for us to be there. And so that's kind of where I left off and continued to follow that. Cuba happened at the same time, and I had kind of the same attitude towards Cuba that, well, I felt that Castro was a democratic reformist. I think there were a number of books. I remember Ted Schultz and some other journalist was going to bring change to Cuba, and so I felt that was a good thing, and I had a ways to go on that also. So anyway, I went to college with some knowledge of world events and some concerns about the social system that exists in the South, but I also went to college with the interesting thing is I had never had the opportunity to meet with any black person on an equal basis, one-to-one, without all the assumptions that went along with the racist assumptions of superiority, this and that. Didn't happen in there. There was I meant to mention about Indian law also. There's a book that was written in 1941 about Indian law called Caste and Class in a Southern Town, which described in detail the whole system. So that wasn't too long before I got there. And I never read that until college, but it describes this as society pretty close. Anyway, so I went off to college a little nervous. I remember I wrote I would like to have a conservative roommate, and I was a little nervous, and people were saying, don't go to Harvard and become a pinko. So that was the local spin on Harvard, or anything from New York or whatever, you know, distrustful from the outside, agitator influence. And so that pretty much wraps up, unless you have some other questions about growing up in Indianola. I mean, I should say too, I had a very normal life, great parents. They were, to me, I was like most teenagers in the 50s. I did all those things, played football in junior high, high school, was in the band, had girlfriends, rode around in cars, listened to rock and roll, and half of which was rhythm and blues also out of WLAC out of Tennessee, which was black rhythm and blues, and of course a lot of rock and roll at that time was also black, which was kind of a wedge, an interesting wedge in the South at that time that our parents didn't quite know what to do with. But so I was I had a normal life growing out of that, and with the exception that there was very little communication and no communication with my black peers or anyone like that. Schools were totally segregated.
As you were coming of age and sort of seeing all this stuff, it sounds like you had access to media, access to libraries. You were learning a lot of things about a lot of things happening outside of your small town, and that you were aware that you didn't your feelings on those things didn't necessarily line up with everyone else's. But did you have anyone to talk to about that stuff, or did you bring it up? Did you try to bring it up in conversation, or?
No, not until I was a senior in high school, I would say, and we were starting to graduate. I do remember I had a good friend who had similar thoughts to me, and we talked about integration, and probably one of the few of my classmates who kind of broke away from that system. It was it was not something that was really done that much. There were, I will say this, were some influences, yes, that I sort of knew about. Number one, there were several people in my church who were more liberal. Most of the people in the church, the Presbyterian church, were more conservative. One from Massachusetts, who I later connected with, who ran some youth groups, and I kind of opened us up about issues. I don't know whether we dealt with race, but I could see there were other ways to think about things. And there was another family also who had our youth group, and at least you began to open about things. Now, this may not sound socially that relevant, but just discussing evolution, accepting evolution, and being able to do that with your religious tradition was a break in the thought pattern, which could lead in other directions, and openness to thinking about things scientifically and so forth. So there were a couple of families that like that ran the youth groups, and then there was a judge who was more liberal, and I think I only learned later, but he helped to run in the summer after I graduated, what do you call it, Socratic group, book club, and we talked about some things too. So I began to realize I could express myself a little more openly. I went to Boise State, but the things we discussed there that I remember had to do with striping highways, it was kind of controlled. I don't think there was anything there of any, social.
Boise State?
Boise State is something the American Legion has sponsored throughout the country, and so students are selected from across the state, and they come and do a mock legislature in the summer. And Bill Clinton did that in Arkansas. And that's where he met Kennedy, I think. But it was not really that much of a eye-opening experience, except the sense that you were growing up and you were empowered to say things, and this is part of the process. But you mentioned too some other little cracks in in the closed society. As I know, in my high school there was a copy of Cry the Beloved Country, which is uh, well, wait. Sorry about that.
No, no, no.
I'll go back. I was saying that there were some other things that kind of showed a crack in the close. Can you edit this?
I don't think we need to. Yeah.
Anyway, as I was saying, that there were some things that kind of showed it wasn't totalitarian totally. In the high school library, there were some books that I read. One was Cry the Beloved Country, which is a book about apartheid in South Africa, one of the early ones, Alan Paton, and it was, reading that certainly gave me a different perspective in terms of seeing African figures who were human and how these things affected them. So that was something I read pretty early on, and just the simple fact of reading a book about George Washington Carver, the black scientist, also gave me, it eroded that idea that whites were superior. And so these things kind of do have effect if you're receptive to it. I don't know why. Totally, I was receptive. Others may not have been. But that's what it was. I know, for instance, as a 7-year-old, memorized the Gettysburg Address, which was about the Civil War and the effects it had, and a lot from the Declaration of Independence about our heritage of everybody being equal. So these things seep in, and you don't know in the long run how they're going to affect you in the long run.
How did you decide on Harvard?
I was lucky enough to get in. Actually, I say it was affirmative action. There was a Mississippian who was in the admissions office, and I convinced them to offer several scholarships to Mississippi. So I was a straight A student and football player and these things, and I guess they liked me. And I had a wonderful English teacher who encouraged me to apply. I also could have gone to Vanderbilt or Tulane. Those were my other choices, but it was exciting. It was something both frightening and exciting.
What was it like for you moving from the Deep South in a small town to?
Well, the interesting thing was I was fairly well prepared. It's interesting enough, coming from a small town high school, which was certainly mixed abilities. We had poor whites, and even though it was segregated, it was not all middle class white. And but I got a decent education, and I guess I had good work habits, and I was prepared, particularly for the sciences. I was not prepared for the thought in the social studies, and I lacked the ability to think critically. That's not totally unusual for freshmen in college, but none of the classes that I had in history or even in English, as good as they were, the English classes, really taught me to think pro and con and look at society critically and to think about. I knew the facts. I knew the Civil War. I knew about Reconstruction, at least part of it, and but I was not prepared for that so much. But it was intimidating, and I do think there was a little bit of a stigma at that time for being from the South, particularly from Mississippi. So I had to deal with that, and but it I enjoyed it. I got into it in a sport. I rode crew, and then but I think the most what I learned the most from early on was, and appreciated, was being able to meet African American students and talk with them and get rid of all of that, baggage that went along with the attitudes of a small town South, and I appreciate that. And I visited. I wouldn't say I was close friends with him, but he was in the same house, and we visited with Herb Denton, who went on to be a Washington Post a writer, and I appreciate his patience and understanding. And there were some African exchange students there or foreign students there who I visited. So this was an eye-opening and my first experience, which I learned a lot from, as well as from the classes, which took me to a new level of looking at history. As many Southerners, I think we learned a lot from C. Van Woodward, the strange career of Jim Crow, and his longer work on the origins of the South or something like that. He was pretty important. And I read Vernon Morton on Reconstruction, so I developed some historical background to deal with what was going on there. And then overall, I had outstanding history classes that helped me to look at history in the long run, change, democratic change. I was very moved by the idea of democracy and the people in history and how that happened. And ironically, though, today Jackson is not seen so great, and justly so, but that was, I enjoyed learning about the democratic movements and the growth of that. So that was important to me. And so I also began to look at some of the issues related to communism and socialism, and there were debates about ends justify the means and the effect of the Soviet economy on the welfare of the Soviet people. Was it worth doing? So these are opening discussions on some big issues. And
outside of the curriculum, were you participating in groups or events or activities on campus?
No, I did not get involved in politics, and it was a pretty quiet political scene. There was one guy I'm pretty sure was who we all knew, who was a member of the May the 4th movement, which I think was an early progressive labor group, but I never really talked to him that much or had him. The greater debate came around the Young Americans for Freedom and the Young Republicans, and I was clear that I could not identify with their philosophy, and of course as the Goldwater-Johnson thing played out, that pretty much solidified how I felt about that. I never was attracted to that, and there was a tremendous enthusiasm for reading The Fountainhead and Ayn Rand, and I just could not accept that. So a lot of the currents like that around, I never, whether I was invited or not, I don't remember, but that was not my thing. I had to work very hard. I did work very hard. I was an honor student, so I was writing a thesis. So I sometimes regret not doing more, but I pretty much was a hard-working student. I wrote a couple of years and then dropped that to write the thesis. My thesis, interestingly enough, had to do with the growth of democracy through the first Great Awakening in New England, how that played out in terms of class and opening up a more democratic vista in the religious structures in Massachusetts.
What was your major?
History.
History.
Colonial history with the emphasis.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
But I took a lot of history classes, China, a number of classes on China and European history.
And then you went to grad school.
Then I left Harvard in '65 and went to the University of Wisconsin. And that was where I became more involved politically and more aware. Wisconsin was a more open atmosphere, a certain class aspect to Harvard at that time, and Wisconsin was very exciting. A lot of students from New York. A lot of I wasn't as aware of this when I first got there, but there were a lot of both New Left students as well as students from the Old Left, from New York, Red Diaper Babies, and they were very active on campus. I didn't until recently know how active, but it was obvious in some cases. And you know, I was enrolled in the Graduate School of History and had some of the best history professors in that area. But I just lost the interest. The classes were not that interesting. I took, and I couldn't get a grasp on the thesis. And I could see everything going on, and I just felt like I didn't want to study history. I wanted to be involved in it. That was kind of the way it evolved, and so you know, with a lot of these things, as I mentioned, you're confronted by the events, and you have to at least individually take your own position on them, and that's what continued to happen. The Vietnam War, by '65, and our involvement had escalated tremendously in the summer. Johnson had sent in hundreds of thousands of troops, and there was a big demonstration in Washington. So that whole activism around the war, as opposed to civil rights, was beginning to happen, and even though students were still focused on civil rights, and a lot of students I knew, I didn't mention that, I say a lot, a few students I knew who went from Harvard down to Mississippi, even one who worked in my own hometown, his name Guerrero, worked in Greenwood, I just learned recently. You know, it kind of made me feel like, you know, shouldn't I be doing something? Yeah, but I give them all, I have such admiration for the people who went to Mississippi. It was dangerous, and they took a lot of risk, and so I can see them as a model in a way. And but by '65, the focus was shifting to the war, even within the civil rights movement. King was starting to speak out against it. Well, maybe that was just a little bit later, but it was shifting, and I became exposed because the campus was very active, and you couldn't go to the student union without seeing people debating and confronting people on the steps of the union. A couple of people, Robert Cohen and Evan Stark, I remember. I don't know why I remember them so well, but they would take on anybody and everybody. This SWP was active there.
SWP?
Socialist Workers Party, the Trotskyist groups. That was very important in the anti-war movement in the long term. They were very systematic about their approach to organizing the anti-war movement, both in Wisconsin and in Atlanta, where we dealt with them and worked with them. And so I began to take the debate more seriously and look at it, because you had to. People, Americans getting killed every day. Was it a good thing? Was the government of South Vietnam a reliable ally? Were they going to do the right thing by the Vietnamese? This is where it was. And so I debated, I listened, I read, I started reading The Guardian, and some of the other media, which led me eventually, of course, to identify with creating a newspaper. I.F. Stone's Weekly, Ramparts. I'm sure I saw the LA Free Press before I was in Atlanta, so I know those were some of the journals, but the Guardian had provided the more consistent news, and so I began to deal with it. And then I, as a historian, I wanted to know, I wanted somebody who was providing facts, and so I read Stanley Carno's book on Vietnam, which is still out in publication, still an excellent piece of analysis and history. And I came to the conclusion from reading that the government of Vietnam was a semi-dictatorship. They were brutalizing the people, they were arresting people, and that 50,000 people were in jail, at least is the way I saw it then, and that the Vietnamese were very determined, as their history showed, to be independent, and perhaps there was no way that the U.S. was going to be able to establish a democratic government in South Vietnam the way they had in Korea that would provide an alternative. So that was what brought me to that, and eventually I participated in the occupation of I think it's called the Peterson administration building, but I'm not sure. In May of '66, I think it was, the occupation of the administration building, and I don't know what the precipitating could have been something to do with the draft. There was a very active organization there, of anti-war organization, and that I wasn't totally as aware of, but that was very successful. The university handled it well. It wasn't like Columbia or anything like that. I think they were there a day or two in the building overnight, and they were kind of rump teach-ins and about the war, and a lot of bonding of students, and then they left. And I remember particularly one big meeting of maybe 400 students in the student union, I think it was, that with people debating this in a very respectful way, and taking everything so serious. And that was impressive to me about how the movement was working there. And so that was my first political action, and moved me along. And the other thing that I did besides reading, and I'll talk about that in a minute, was I connected with some other graduate students who were producing an underground newspaper called Connections, and it's considered the first underground newspaper in Madison. And Bob Cabrina and Vicky Cabrina, Vicky, who eventually worked on the Bird for a while, interestingly enough, from Wisconsin. She's originally from New York, I think. And so I worked on that from maybe March of '67 to this middle of the summer '67, and my major contribution was writing a long piece on the Chancellor, the President, I don't know what they call him, Fleming, and the university, basically coming from the critique of the university as being used by the Cold War apparatus and the military to support the Cold War. Had drawn some of that from a guy named Seymour Melman, and I think probably reading about the Berkeley, earlier Berkeley free speech movement, perhaps I drew some of that, but I'd have to reread it to really know. But it was a long graduate student piece. We never would have published in the Great Speckled Bird, but I worked on that for a while. And there's some other students. Russell Jacoby, I think, is a name that's better known. I think he's a historian at UCLA now. And but that kind of ended my involvement at Wisconsin. I did read some things. My own thought developed more. One of the more important books that I read was The One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, which was kind of a cultural Marxism. Basically, a thesis, if I remember, having to do with how current capitalism was and technology were used to in a sense, and consumerism to create in humans these demands that made it hard to think critically of the system. And essentially created a one-dimensional man. You were the consumer, and other aspects of life were left out. Yeah, it was a very familiar, it was more popular critique that was all throughout the 50s. His was a little more philosophical, but it had elements of the affluent society. There was some other sociologists who wrote on this issue of conformity and so forth from a slightly less philosophical level, but it struck a note with me. I thought it was a very powerful argument in terms of where our society was.
Were you able to talk to your family? Like when you'd go home for the holidays?
I never talked to my parents about any of this.
Do you think they suspected, or do you?
Well, I don't know about graduate school. I think they were disappointed that I didn't finish graduate school. Later on when I got into a little more left, I wouldn't doubt, I have never gotten my papers from the Freedom of Information Enactment. I wouldn't doubt the FBI visited them. I think they were hurt by it all. But we never talked about it.
And you said earlier you had a sister. Did you only have one sibling?
I had a sister who, interestingly enough, was, as I said, she was a student at Ole Miss, and the student very close with James Silver, the author of Close Society, and then she went to work for Frank Smith, who was considered kind of a liberal congressman from the Greenwood area. And eventually he got defeated. And that's interesting. And she married into a more liberal family there in Greenwood, and which, for their speaking out and being on the Human Relations Committee in Mississippi, things were thrown in their house. I don't think it was firebomb. I think there were rocks, or maybe even fired into their house. I'm not sure. So there was that element. I may have talked to Melinda and my sister and my brother-in-law about some of these things, but it was kind of, people eventually knew, I think, that had kind of gone in a different direction, but I didn't initiate conversations about it.
So what happened after Wisconsin? You didn't finish, and you'd been more actively involved.
Yeah, and I finished up at Wisconsin, and my draft affirmative run out, and I needed to do something, and I signed up for Vista and went to Vista, and I think I probably chose Atlanta, but I may have just been assigned there. I wouldn't doubt I chose Atlanta because I was from the South, and I knew Atlanta, and to me it had the reputation as being a more progressive city in terms of race, even though it had its problems with the war sit-ins and some other things I was aware of. And I knew also that there were some issues there. There had been a riot in Summerhill. People's Town, Summerhill, there, and right below where the stadium is, in the summer of '66, and which Stokely Carmichael was involved in. So I had read about that, probably in the Guardian, and there were so many riots in those days in cities, particularly in '67, but this was the year before. It was right after I wasn't there, but it was right after the Meredith March, and that was when Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee began to advocate Black Power and became more militant, and that was part of what happened in Atlanta from my reading the news sources and so forth. But I knew there was tension there, and so I was anxious to go there, maybe be a part of doing something. And we went to Atlanta. We trained at the Gammon Theological, old building down there at the foot of Capitol Avenue, now Hank Aaron. I think it turns into Hank Aaron. And maybe 40, 50 Vista, 30, 40 Vista trainees. We trained there, and then we, went out and chose to do what we wanted to do. It was not very structured at all. And I matched up with Don Spiker, who was later a major part of the Early Bird, and a great guy. And so we chose to live in an area called Primrose Circle, which was at the southern part of Peoplestown, which is the community just south of Atlanta Avenue, south of Summerhill. And it was a very poor area. It probably was built in the 50s, I'm guessing. It was kind of a circular cement block duplexes. That's what the houses were. 3 rooms, front room, bedroom, and a kitchen. Kind of a city shotgun in a way, but it was duplex too. So, and cement floors, unadorned cement block walls, warm enough, basic housing. And there were about 30, 40 units, I would say, there. And so we lived there, and I can't say we did anything that was that incredible. We provided transportation services to Grady Hospital. I think we tried to start a food cooperative. We worked with some young people for a while, and we tried to get a tutoring, and this was probably the most significant effort, maybe last a month or two, to get a tutoring service using Spelman College students. So that was the most of it. But by the end of '67, we were kind of looking for something else. And so that was when Don, I think, is the one who, I think he got that mimeograph announcement. Either that or he brought back the word, but it seems like he had that announcement. It was like January or December or January of 66, 67. I mean, sorry, 67, 68. I may have said, 67, 68. And so we ended up going to the meeting. I think it was set for January 7th on that Mimeo. And I can't say that I remember everybody was there. Don and I were there. I'm sure Tom and Stephanie, Jean was there. I can't remember. Some other people may have who were on top of it, would remember better. I know we were there, and that was the way the plans were laid. And I didn't know everything that was going on. That Howard had gotten a grant from NSA, and that they had a house on 14th Street that we could use, but you know, I had some experience, brief as it was. Um, Not a lot of experience writing journalistically, but writing, but doing layout for a offset press, I had that experience of the simple process that we used of pasting it up and using rub-on the art supplies to make the headlines, and so I was enthusiastic. That was the beginning.
So the Vista program did not pan out for you. Did you?
Well, it did. We were active from summer '67 through, and then we probably kept doing some things, because the Bird wasn't full time at first. It was,
Right.
you know, it was part time at best, beginning. So we continued to work there and provide some services, but I can't remember when it ended or whether we terminated. I just don't remember that. But you know, within a matter of months, you know, we were pretty active, pretty full time with the paper, beginning in March, sure. In the week. Don wrote a major piece in the first issue, which was a critique of the liberal media and how they were using objectivity to defend the Vietnam War and the use of nuclear weapons. That was Ralph McGill, the editor of the Constitution. That was a really fine piece, and Don kind of said, Tom, his kind of introductory statement kind of reiterated that statement. And so we became pretty involved right away, and Vista was secondary after that.
What was that excitement like? Sort of this group of people coming together with a common cause.
Well,
I'm assuming it was there was.
It was exciting, but it was kind of like, okay, I've done this before. This is what's happening. This is the way the movement works. You know, we have all these issues, the Vietnam War and civil rights particularly, but there were other things, poverty, and because poverty was a big issue then. If you remember, Michael Harrington's book, The Other America. I mean, that kind of was another book that said we need to do that. Was about Appalachian poverty, but it was one of those things that a lot of us read and said, you know, this is not right. And I'm sure that book had an effect on Johnson's War on Poverty. Of course, we were right in the middle of the War on Poverty because, and Vista, I didn't mention that was part of that, and it was part of the Office of Economic Opportunity had offices, and they were running a number of programs in areas like Peoplestown, and there was a Model Cities project that was headquartered nearby. That I don't know all of what they did, but they were doing some significant things, and then there was, you know, there was. I don't know whether legal aid came out of that also, but that was important. I remember meeting the Maynard Jackson, who was in legal aid at that time. And so there was a lot of things happening that the War on Poverty had kind of put in play, and Vista was related to. And in terms of what was happening while I was in Vista too, there were things that were ongoing in the community. There was a place called the Emmaus House, which was an Episcopal project that was on Capitol Avenue. And they did a lot of things related to services to the community. So that was happening there in the community. And Vine City was another area that was poor, and it had riots related. I think there were riots in '66 and '67, and came to know a guy named Hector Black, who was a wonderful he happened to be a Harvard graduate, but that's beside the point. But he was a Quaker. His wife was a Mennonite, and he lived in Vine City with his 2 or 3 daughters, and just he was a pacifist, and he was there to help out, and he did what he could. Eventually, SNCC criticized him for being there, and this was after the issue of Black Power came up and so forth. And I think he moved out of there, but he was doing some things there, and so there were things happening that we knew were happening, and it was just great to meet other people. And we were kind of isolated all during that time. We did meet some other Vista people, and but we didn't have any strong connections, I would say. I never went over in that area, that 14th Street area, that I remember, and or to there were hippie coffee houses, or whatever you want to call them, coffee houses. I don't like the word hippie so much, but anyway, it was great to connect with people and connect with something I'd done before, which was producing a newspaper around issues that I was concerned with and ready to take more action on than I had, particularly in civil rights. And so I saw that as, in terms of the Bird, for me, it was a way to do that and expand on that, and I could see the power of the newspapers in terms of the effect that it had on me, whether it was I.F. Stone or the effect of the Free Press, The Guardian, and I said, well, this is great. Atlanta doesn't have anything like this, and we might be able to raise these issues and share these issues. I didn't know where it would go. I couldn't have envisioned the form it totally took as it did, but it was exciting, and I was interested in a couple of areas. I was very kind of connected to the idea of the student movement and how the student movement could affect change. So that was something that I wanted to write about. I wanted to connect with students, and a lot of others, of course, those from the Southern Student Organizing Committee, they'd already been there and done that, but most people wanted to do that too, but I wanted to make sure that the newspaper was speaking to those students. And Tom came out of that, also Tom Coffin out of Emory. But I was interested in connecting with high school students because I thought they could be motivated to be involved, and we had our connections with SDS in Athens through David Simpson and Jim Skillman, and SDS at Georgia State, and so that was something I was glad to be a part of in terms of the anti-war movement, and that was my major thrust, other than the civil rights issues related to bringing greater opportunity or limiting discrimination, which was always there for me. I mean, originally I didn't mention this, that coming from Mississippi and seeing the poverty and the lack of the poor education that the black population received, originally I thought I had a choice between going into the School of Education at Harvard and going to Wisconsin, and I almost did the former, and eventually that's where I ended up. But I just felt that education was really important. For a good education is very, very, very important, and that's I had thought maybe about going back to Mississippi and teaching and becoming an administrator. Who knew what? But I could see that as a path to improving society, a slow one perhaps, but then I got involved in Wisconsin and moved to a different way of looking at things for a while, and so there we were, March 1968, the first issue of the Great Speckled Bird. a lot of it is a blur. It was very exciting, and we responded to so many issues. I mean, that year of 1968 was just, in terms of mass movements and social change and demonstrations and so forth throughout the world, was just incredible. So, I mean, that certainly fed the excitement at the Bird and gave us momentum. And I mean, we were looking at just a month after, well, 2 weeks after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and we had riots erupting all over the country, and we had the McCarthy campaign generating up, that whole Democratic campaign. Gosh, it was just on and on and on. I think May and June were, that was Columbia, which was a big campus blowout when the students at Columbia took over the university, and it was kind of the beginning of the more radical SDS too, I would say, in some ways. But there was that, and there was France, huge outpouring of protests from students and workers in France and Czechoslovakia, and then demonstrations in the fall. So there were a lot of events outside that were driving us and giving us opportunity to report and share. And then there were the local things, whether it's police violence. I know there was a good article in the second issue about police violence in a small town in Georgia. An excellent article there. And these are just ongoing issues that just keep coming up of great interest and importance. And that just drove us forward. We responded to events, we responded to movements as they developed. Certainly, we didn't start out being a feminist or a women's oriented newspaper that came up, and the women group got very involved in consciousness raising groups and women's movement, and formed their own organizations, and had that influence on the positive influence on the newspaper that led to a lot of reporting. I think 68, 69, I think it was. And so that happened, and I don't think we were as forward looking on the gay movement as, at least I don't remember that, because maybe it didn't come up when I was there. I left in 70. But environmental issues we addressed to some degree. But it was just very exciting to be able to reflect and share these things that we were learning or thinking about, and be able to put it into a newspaper that, eventually we were selling 20,000 papers, I think, at the peak. And having an effect. And, I kind of saw myself as, and so did others, I know, but I had the idea of the participant journalist. So there were a couple of things that I got involved with at times. I participated in the anti-war meetings. Not always, but it was particularly the last one. I'm pretty sure I don't even remember the name of it, of that particular alliance, but I was on the steering committee of that and spoke at one of the rallies. And so other than that, I would occasionally write about it, as others did. But I did participate as well to write about it. And then at Georgia State, Jim Skillman and I, he was the SDS chair there, organized a march to demand of the university that they do more to recruit and support African American students at Georgia State. So I don't remember the demands we made, but we marched down the street, and we were stopped in the middle of the street by the police at one point, and then we ended up, I believe, somewhere over by the Capitol. I can't remember. It's hard to remember where Georgia State is. 'Cause
Cortlandt Street goes that way.
yeah, there's a bridge there that went
Mhm.
across that we were stopped on for
That sounds like Cortlandt Street.
10 minutes in rush hour. But nobody was arrested. Another place, another time, it could have been a lot worse. And we eventually ended up doing the demonstration. And I don't know, Jill might have a better idea of whether there was any result out of that, but we at least put it on the agenda. And but we worked, pretty steady, whether typically working on an article, whether a short article, long article. I remember I went up to Orangeburg, South Carolina after what was called the Orangeburg Massacre, and did a report on that. Several students were killed as they had been protesting a segregated bowling alley, I think is what the issue was. And the Highway Patrol, I think it was, opened fire on them. And so I was up there for that. There's so much, it's hard to remember. You go through and look at it and say, I wrote that. I was pleased with one article I wrote. That was Don Spiker, my roommate in Vista, eventually refused the draft. And I wrote a piece on that I was very proud of Don and what he did. And what else?
Well, I have a question about how in the early days the bird was organized. How were decisions made about who would do what?
Yeah. Well, from the beginning it was organized as a cooperative. Was it called the Atlanta Cooperative News Project? I think it was. And that was kind of along with everybody signing their names with lowercase. It was the individual wasn't important. We need to have cooperative, collaborative decision making. So we met every week and decided the major issues. I don't think it was, as a firm and fast rule, but as to what went in, because things would come up after that, and as we were laying it out, we might need some other article we might pull from the Liberation News Service that we used, and so it was flexible decision. But the meetings were very political, and we discussed, the political ideas and as they applied to the selection of the articles and what we wanted to feature. And it could be long meetings. That was a part of it. The other part of it, for most of us, was layout night and production night. We all did that. Some a little more than others, but they could be all night production parties where you were typing, laying out pasting, proofing, and doing all the other things you need to do, correcting the mistakes. And we typed, on a Selectric typewriter. By a few months in, it was Nan and Stephanie and Claire, Pam at that time, and I think Miller Francis did a lot of the typing, but all of us did a little bit, and I did a little bit, and then Stephanie did a lot of the coordinating of the layout. Ventured into Fibbin was big. I think Claire did a good bit, and I can always remember being there and doing 1 or 2 pages at least, and just jumping in and doing what needed to be done, whether it's typing a correction, pasting down, or doing a whole page or whatever. And so those were kind of exciting nights and bonding nights, and Tom was the editor in the beginning, and he was really the glue. And Tom and Stephanie were always there in the beginning. They lived in the birdhouse, and they were the connection to our outside writers, who were very important. I mean, it's hard to remember all the writers who wrote for the Bird, some of whom I never met, and I read their names and said, I don't know him, but excellent writing. You know, Dennis Jarrett, I don't know that I ever met him, but he wrote some nice pieces there. Gary Chuse probably never came to the meetings, but I don't remember him too much, but he wrote some really good stuff in the early days. But there were the outside columnists. Eliza Pascal was a kind of a progressive Democrat who worked in the women's movement, helped to found NOW, and had worked with the Human Relations Commission there, and was, for some reason, I don't know why, was probably being a little too strong, was thrown off the Human Relations Council. That was one of her first articles. She wrote regularly and was a strong voice. So we have a professor who wrote some satirical pieces, Og, King of Bashan. Ernie Morris was kind of a Woody Guthrie character who wrote Woody Guthrie kinds of articles on molasses and quinine. They were sometimes satiric pieces, often satiric pieces, folksy kind of, as well as Bud Foots were. We had Eric Bonner, who wrote these kind of William Burroughs stream of consciousness things that were quite interesting to some people, and they were brilliant in a way. But Miller Francis, who wrote about the music, and Miller was a kind of a applied Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message, and he really felt that rock and roll was was revolutionary in its own way, and that it would change people as much as the political rhetoric or political ideas. And he believed in that as it may not be statingly totally accurate. It may have been a little more political in his statements than that, but he did do some excellent reviews of movies and music, and was a great addition. Ron Osborne, who was the cartoonist, who did a lot of the things. A lot of graphic artists like Paige Bunnell, Diane Berger, Randall Ransom, who contributed. They may not have been around the birdhouse for layout night or whatever, but they were in and out. There's just so many people. You leave them out, and it's the sad things, can't remember them all. As the staff said, when they, at the top of the staff said something like, "These are a few of the hundreds of people who were," you know, and there were a lot of people who, inside and out. The letters were often very good. We had one letter from Vietnam I saw that was just I think it was a journalist, just excellent description of where we were in 68, excuse me, and so it was a lot of outside contribution. It wasn't just us writing. Ted Brodick, who was a professor at Emory, who wrote very straightforward, clear pieces about Vietnam, very well written. Gene Guerrero, who was the business manager, and rolled out our paychecks for $40 a week eventually, and he wrote on country music, as did Anne Remain, and Tom always wrote interesting pieces reflecting on events, and as time went on, I think women wrote more and more. I know Claire, I said, I wrote some pieces on abortion, and there were labor. Nan wrote a lot. It's just so hard to remember everyone, because it was a cooperative effort, and we really didn't have an ideology in the beginning, for sure. I think in the end there were some efforts to push it more ideological, and I wasn't there quite then, but it was an open forum for anything left of center about, and so it had a broad voice. And then there was a lot of reporting eventually on the plight of the street people, the young people who had flocked to Atlanta and were living there, whether for the drugs or for just friendship or experience and the way the police harassed them. So we did do a lot of coverage on that. But it was pretty wide open in terms of the range of political views that were expressed, and I think that was part of its success. You know.
In talking about all of that, you mentioned a lot of names, and many of those folks we have either interviewed or are planning to interview.
Right.
But then you brought up Claire, and that made me think that, or made me remember that in the beginning there were
Pam.
she was Pam then,
Right.
and then there were 3 or 4 couples that were at the bird, like there at the beginning, kind of, and you know, the women still in. Well, it was interesting to me, still these traditional marriage roles, and that a lot of the women were having kids at the same time.
Yeah.
So what was it like from your perspective, being part of, you know, being a young husband and father and doing this kind of work?
Well, you know, I don't know. I think that certainly that there was that tendency, as in the movement, the males had the truth and they were going to be the writers. I think there was some of that that had to be broken down. But in terms of family and sharing, you know, I think we shared quite a bit from the beginning, Claire and I, Pam and I, and so you probably get a better view from her and the opinions, but you know, I stayed home we had to survive, so I know that in '69 that I ended up, while working for the Bird, I ended up staying home with my son Jesse, who was born January '69. Instead, there were 3 kind of bird babies that made me leave at 1 or 2, but Zachary was Stephanie's child, and Jesse, our child, Zachary, Stephanie Tom's, and they were the ones that were most around the Bird, because on layout nights they could be in the crib next to you know, we all tried to help care for them, but these were nursing babies, so it was that time when it was difficult for the male to do some things. But I think Stephanie and Pam Claire would give you the better picture of that. Something I'm not going to remember the same way. I felt like I shared a lot in the raising of both my children, so it was difficult. I mean, you know, and that was part of the issue. I had the second child in '71, and you know, just having the money and the wherewithal made it difficult after a certain point to keep going. Claire worked I think she worked at the hospital for a while during that period. That was when I stayed home. I was home. Probably latter '69, something like that.
What was public reception to the Bird like?
You know,
and
there were people who loved it and there were people who hated it. So, I mean, it would be hard for me to give a overall view of that. And we got letters from people saying, please cancel my subscription, this dirty, obscene newspaper. I don't want to ever see it again. I'll sue if you send it to me. And there were people who wrote from all over the South saying, you know, I'm so glad to get this connection and to read something that is different or hear a different view. And we did. We shipped papers all over the South. And we even, interesting side note is that David Doggett, who started a newspaper in Jackson, Mississippi called Kudzu, probably in '71, '72. I had known in Indianola, his father was a Methodist minister, and I was good friends with his brother John, so it was interesting reconnecting. David got active in, I think it was at Millsaps in the civil rights movement, and he kind of tried to get things going there. It was very difficult in Jackson. I have great admiration for him, and struggled through a lot of things. And he came he worked with SOC, he joined up with SOC, and he came to Atlanta, I think, to learn how to run a newspaper, and then he went back to Mississippi and started Kudzu. So our effect, reached a lot of places, and we covered things in Gainesville and Birmingham, and so that, those people who were ready to hear it, and there were quite a few people hearing throughout the South, and but there were those who didn't like it. I think that there were some things that we did that probably made it harder for some people to hear it. The whole MF issue that arose.
Everybody brings up that issue.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how I felt about that at the time. It certainly was used. It certainly helped to broaden the definition of free speech in the South and legally, and but I don't know that it broadened our readership. To me, there are people who will disagree with that and say, "Well, this is what we need to do is provoke." So that would be an ongoing discussion.
Is there anything about the bird I haven't brought up that you want to talk about?
Well, I think towards the end, after SDS broke up and it split up, and some of the people came to Atlanta, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, as it was called. They began to have a little more influence in the newspaper, and I think the paper may have become a little more ideological. At the same time, that was a period when, labor, after I was out of the paper, it became more labor oriented, essentially because they were strikes to report on.
Mm-hmm.
But, gosh, anything else? Why don't you turn it off and let me take a break?
Oh yeah, let's take a break, of course.
I kind of ramble on, I'm sorry.
No, you aren't rambling at all. This is So when you left the Great Speckled Bird, what was next?
Well, as I was saying, that there were some ideological trends on the Bird, and I think we were all being influenced in some ways by our disappointment with the rapidity of change and the Vietnam War not coming to an end, and the whole idea of imperialism as being something that was just in our involvement in Vietnam as part of that, which then was connected to the way capitalism works as a system. So we began to look at more systematic ways of approaching the problem rather than issue by issue. And so I was influenced by that, in about the middle of the 70s, it must have been about summer of 70s, maybe, it might even before that, I was recruited into the October League, and I became a part of that, and got a job working for the sanitation department, and didn't do a whole lot in terms of activity in either that or my next job in the Atlantic Steel company, but was working and also at the same time writing and producing a paper with the October League, and that went on until '72. During that time, we met in groups and discussed, and a lot of ideological talk, and then we moved out to LA and continued to do something similar. And I worked at Martin Marietta and continued to write for a newspaper. And then I just became disillusioned, both for personal reasons and I think just looking at things and feeling like this was not going to happen, and that we were not dealing with reality. I think that's where I was, and returned to my earlier. I had 2 children I had to take care of, and returned to my original orientation, which was to work in education and to apply my skills and my background to providing a quality education to young people, and that's what I did. And so by 1975, I was I got my credential, and I was teaching in Los Angeles Unified School District.
Well, let's talk about the move back. So what precipitated that?
It was related to the organizations we were with.
Okay. So
and their needs.
okay.
Happened to correspond with Claire's mom living out here, but that was okay. And
What did you think about California?
no, I'd been out here before. It wasn't my first choice,
Okay.
but it was good for the kids at least. But we were kind of in a fog. We were in the middle of this movement, and it was driving us, and we were deeply involved, and it took over our lives for a period of time. And we were working in different factories and discussing and trying to raise our kids. Had them in some child care facilities while we worked, and then things kind of fell apart, both personally and politically, and that was when I said that's enough. And
What kind of response were you getting from your coworkers when you would try to talk to them about the October League? I mean,
I would say I was basically underground. The jobs I had, I never talked about the October League.
okay.
If I had done anything, it would have been related to the union work.
Okay.
So I probably wasn't the ideal cadre, but like I said, I don't think my effectiveness of my work there, either for the union or for the organization, was not what others did. But I was involved in producing the papers, and that was my main task, really.
Was there sort of a turning point that sort of started your disillusionment with the October League and what they were working toward?
Well, I just could see that it wasn't happening, with what my expectations were. I'm not sure I was fully committed to begin with.
Okay.
And, I was all in favor of the labor organizing, but the other part of it, I think after a certain point, I just didn't see that was going to work out. So that's about it.
Okay.
Where I can leave it. And, we had some family issues that played into it, but I needed to pull my life back together and get a job and support the kids, and education was a good place for me to be. And I felt eventually that I found a meaningful connection with many of the goals that I had on the bird, whether it was working with minority students to see that they got a good education and a quality education, and teaching history to raise those issues that I never got to deal with when I was in high school, discussing things pro and con, and looking at the moral issues in societies, whether it was slavery or the Holocaust or those kinds of things, and getting kids to think, and as well as learn the facts of history. So I spent 31 years in the school system, 30 years in the school system, and both as a teacher and as an administrator, and I felt that I was able to use my skills, my knowledge to enhance the education for mostly the minority kids that in most of the situations I was in, I was dealing with schools that were predominantly minority. And my goal usually was to make sure that we were offering students a challenge, as a assistant principal, a challenging education, that kids had the opportunity to take a college preparatory curriculum. They may not always have gotten through it, but at least we needed to push them as far as those particular students could go. Ideally, all students would have that kind of education where when they graduate from high school, they can choose whether they want to go to college or a trade school, and their abilities will be there in terms of math and writing, that they're able to decide at any point in their life to pursue more education. But that was generally my goal, and to ensure that students who wanted to go to the top level would have access to advanced placement classes or honors classes that would prepare them to go to a University of California school or a top school. That was kind of my overall vision, and I would use whatever influence I had to push that philosophy, whether it was teaching junior high honors kids or in history or the principal of a high school.
Did you ever let me see, how am I trying to say this? In your time in the schools, did you see a lot of change in the education system over the years that you were here?
I would say yes. Because the first 3 or 4 years you're learning the system yourself, and you're just kind of trying to hang on and keep control of your classroom and provide the best you can. I think, and despite what people say, the education is a lot better than it was 30 years ago. People seem to think schools are failing, but when I began school, kids could graduate high school 2 years of basic math, 3 years of remedial English. It was just a very limited curriculum in LA. The schools in LA were not as good as the schools back east. That was for sure, in terms of what was expected. It wasn't anything like what I got in a little town in now, having said that, I can't speak for the curriculum with a high school, a black high school in so it was probably not the same.
Mm-hmm.
But in the years that the academic requirements have, essentially now the University of California requirements, Algebra 2, 4 years of English, not remedial English, science, 2 science classes, 2 foreign language, the whole academic class. There's some downsides of that. I think we've eliminated a lot of the industrial arts education that can be useful to a kid. I think this should have maintained more of that. One of the things I know in the last high school I was in was to try to ensure that the current job training kinds of classes were relevant. So we had, I didn't totally instigate all this, but I expanded. We had a very successful basic computer management class that kids loved, where they learned computer skills, some computer maintenance, how to take apart and put it back together. I had a great guy who did that. Very popular class, as well as advanced computer science. Computer design, graphics, internet design, which was just emerging at the time. A film, previously there was a film class. It was part of a magnet.
we had an architecture magnet. We expanded it into the film and visual arts, graphic arts class. So I think you try to take what you know and make it applicable. Over the long run, I think education is better. There's still a lot of issues, but it's so much better than it was. And I would say that by and large, the behavior, I mean, there were times in the 80s and early 90s where things were pretty out of control, the gang issues in the schools and so forth. Even at a suburban school as I was at, it was not so good, even though we had a good school academically for some kids. Still it was not good. But I think overall that the kinds of discipline that is being pushed, a reduction in suspensions and more counseling and approach to discipline. Admittedly, I haven't been in schools for 10 years. My wife is also an administrator, and she's been subbing. She would probably say the same thing, though. The whole push for test scores, I think, did, and there's some limitations to testing and judging everything by test scores. I think that did raise the academic standards, and I think the schools have improved there. Of course, they have a long way to go. I mean, the schools are still way underfunded out here. I mean, we have 40 kids in a high school senior English class or social studies class. It's think of being a teacher and grading that many papers. You get 5 classes of 40. It's just about an impossible job. And but I think the public schools do a lot better job than they are given credit for.
And you were a member of United Teachers of LA and the Association of California School Administrators.
Right.
And do those function essentially to
well, UTLA is a traditional union. Now it does try to reach across.
Is it AFL-CIO affiliated?
I'm trying to remember. It's AFT-NEA.
American Federation of Teachers?
I don't know whether it's AFL-CIO.
Okay, because AFT is, I believe, affiliated, but NEA is not.
Yeah, I think they're affiliated with both AFT and NEA. It was an interesting arrangement. And do you think it's possible? It got started about the time I started teaching. I think 71 was one of the first actions, and it's still pretty active, and it's not. There's been pretty much a struggle by the powers that be to limit its power, as nationwide it has, and the charters have undercut it, and that's part of the purpose of charters is to reduce the power of the unions, I think. And it's a tricky balance for teachers unions because they've got to serve the interests of the students, and there's a balance between salaries and class size, and yet you have professional people who spent 5-6 years in education, and they expect a certain salary, and the public doesn't always see that. So it's a little bit different union. It's not just it's people's children we're talking about, in addition to supporting teachers, and then the teachers have to convince the public that having a steady, well-paid professional staff will benefit their students. So it's a lot of public relations in that area. But it's, I think it's done a lot. I mean, I was a member, and I was a loyal member, and it did increase our salaries and protect jobs, and sometimes there are conflicts. When you become an administrator, you see it from a different angle, and you're looking out for the interests of what's best for kids, and not the teachers don't, but what's the best interest of education and the kid, and you're dealing with teachers who are not performing well, and how do you discipline them, or if they're that bad, and there are sometimes some that are that bad, how do you dismiss them? So it's you put the other shoe on, it gets tough, and sometimes it's very difficult to get rid of poor performing teachers. You have to do something pretty extreme to be able to dismiss them. So that was a frustration I think I had as an administrator, even though I was a strong UTLA member and I understood that. But I worked closely with the union, and very good friends with the union ultimately, not formally, but I worked very well with her in making sure due process was met, and that was the thing the union brought, was to ensure the students had due process. So that was, you had to go through all the steps, and always, when at the meetings, the union rep was always there with us, and so it was fair as according to the rules. And sometimes the union rep would like for that person to go too, because it was, when you have a bad teacher, it reflects on all the teachers. It's not just a job. You're not making widgets. So it's a tricky thing, and you try to be fair and make the right decisions. And then AXA is a union of sorts, but it's a little more of a lobbying organization in terms of lobbying for laws that will what administrators think. Sometimes they're not always the best positions, but a lot of times they are. They're in the benefit of everyone. Lobbying state legislatures for rules that will benefit the running of the schools. Outside of LA, it also is a representative arm for smaller school districts where administrators being disciplined, and they need a representative. So it is, and inside LA we had something called ALA, which did that. If somebody was an administrator did something that they could be dismissed for, reprimanded for, they would be there to represent you.
Well, I don't think I have any more questions, but I wonder if there's anything you would like to include that maybe we didn't cover, or that you'd like to add. Anything about your family, anything about your career?
I think I've covered it all. I'm sure I'll think of something later, but I think it's been pretty thorough. I thought a lot about it, and I tried to include the points that I thought were important.
And you didn't need to look at your notes, or did you cover everything?
I'm pretty sure I can do that. Do you want to turn the video?
Oh, sure, yeah. If you want to, of course.
I don't know
Let's pause it.
what's happened is